In the quiet shadows of history, there comes a moment when a nation must pause, look into the mirror, and confront the truth of what it claims to be. America, a land carved from dreams, dreams of freedom, justice, and opportunity. But dreams, as powerful as they are, often collide with reality. And in the years that followed the Civil War, that reality was harsh, divided, broken. The fields of battle had gone silent. The chains of slavery had been shattered. But the scars ran deep. A question echoed across the valleys, the cities, the very heart of the nation. Are we truly free? And does that freedom belong to all, or only to a few? The Constitution, once hailed as a beacon of liberty, held within its words both hope and contradiction. For millions who had known only bondage, freedom was not yet full. Citizenship was uncertain, rights were fragile, justice elusive, but history teaches us the most powerful changes are born from struggle. The brightest lights emerge from the darkest nights. It was in this turbulent, uncertain America that a dream began to take shape, a dream of equality not as mere words, but as the living heartbeat of a nation. Imagine it. Soldiers returning home to towns divided by hate, families torn apart by war, communities asking what comes next. From the ashes of conflict rose a quiet but unstoppable determination. That liberty could no longer be chained by race, by status, by the shadows of the past. The leaders of that time, weary yet unyielding, faced a crossroads. They understood something profound: freedom unfinished. Is freedom denied? Justice delayed? Is justice betrayed? And so, the dream ignited that every person, regardless of color or birthplace, could stand equal beneath the law, not in whispers, not in empty speeches, but carved into the very foundation of the American promise. It was not easy. The path was stained with resistance, with prejudice, with fear. But in the halls of Congress, in the homes of activists, in the silent prayers of those long oppressed, a vision crystallized that one day the law would not only shield the privileged, but lift the oppressed. That one day equality would not be a distant ideal, but a living, breathing right. This was the dawn of the 14th Amendment, a promise, a battle, a belief that though the journey was hard, the dream of equality was worth every sacrifice. Because nations, like people, are not measured by perfection, but by the courage to become better. And so the seeds were sown. The fight for true equality had only just begun. But how does a nation rewrite its own destiny? How do mere words in a document reshape the future? Stay with me, because the birth of the 14th Amendment is the story of that very battle. In every great nation's history, there comes a moment when the words written on paper must evolve to meet the needs of the people. For America, that moment came in the ashes of civil war. The battlefields had fallen silent, but the wounds, they remained open. Over 600,000 lives lost, cities in ruin, families divided. Yet beyond the physical scars, a deeper question haunted the soul of the nation. What does freedom truly mean if equality is denied? The Emancipation Proclamation had declared millions free, yet their future remained uncertain. Citizenship was fragmented, rights were undefined, states clung to old prejudices like chains that refused to break. But in the heart of Washington, D.C., among the marble pillars and echoing chambers of Congress, there were those who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. They understood that freedom without protection is an illusion. They understood that if America was to heal, it could not return to the shadows of its past. The Constitution, revered, yet incomplete, needed a new chapter, one that would reflect not only the ideals of liberty, but the hard lessons carved by war. And so, in 1866, brave voices rose, determined to reshape the nation's foundation. Leaders like Congressman John Bingham, a man fueled by faith and justice, carried a vision that extended beyond party lines, beyond political gain. His mission was simple, yet revolutionary, to guarantee that every person born on American soil was an equal citizen, protected under the law, no exceptions, no hidden barriers, no second-class status based on race, birthplace, or history. It was a declaration not just of rights, but of dignity. For the first time, the promise of we, the people, would stretch to those once enslaved, to those marginalized, to those silenced by prejudice. Imagine the courage it took. In an era stained by division, with wounds still fresh, they dared to believe America could be more than its history. It could be a symbol of hope. For all, the debates were fierce. The resistance was real. There were those who warned of chaos, who clung to the old order, who believed equality threatened their comfort. But history favors the bold, and in July 1868, after months of tireless debate, the 14th Amendment was ratified. In just 86 words, the course of the nation was forever altered. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Those words held power. They held responsibility. They carried the weight of centuries of dreams deferred, of voices silenced, of chains shattered. But they also carried hope, the hope that a nation could rise above its flaws, and that equality was no longer a distant dream, but a constitutional right. The 14th Amendment wasn't just ink on parchment. It was a battle cry for justice, a legal shield for the vulnerable, a mirror forcing America to face its true reflection. But as history shows us, words alone don't guarantee change. They spark it, and in the years to come, that spark would ignite battles, courtrooms, protests, and triumphs, all in the name of equality. The fight was far from over. Stay with me, because the words of the 14th Amendment were only the beginning. Some words drift into history unnoticed, but some strike like thunder across the sky, and their echo reshapes the world. The 14th Amendment carried such words, quietly written, fiercely debated, and ultimately unstoppable in their power. Words that carried more than ink. Words that carried generations of pain, of hope, of unfulfilled promises. It wasn't just about laws. It was about identity. It was about belonging. It was about telling every soul walking the streets of America, you matter. But to understand the weight of those words, we must step back. Picture the America of 1868, wounds of war still raw. A nation uncertain if unity could survive. Millions newly freed, yet bound by fear, denied by law, dismissed by society, and into this fragile moment came a simple yet seismic declaration: no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Let those words settle. No state shall deprive equal protection of the laws. It wasn't just a policy. It wasn't politics. It was a promise from a bruised nation to every citizen. You are seen. You are valued. You are protected. The 14th Amendment drew its strength not from swords, but from its unwavering clarity. Citizenship by birthright, no more guessing who belongs. Due process of law, no more arbitrary power over life and freedom. Equal protection, no more dividing walls based on race, class, or history. But these words, as powerful as they were, sparked more than hope. They sparked fear, resistance, legal battles that would rage for decades. Some clung to the old order, afraid that equality for one meant less for another. But justice doesn't divide. It multiplies. The words of the 14th Amendment carried across the fields of the South, through the factories of the North, into the hearts of those once ignored. Imagine being a young black child hearing for the first time that the Constitution recognizes your humanity. Imagine families once enslaved, now told, you belong. You are equal under the law. But words, even revolutionary ones, face trials. And soon, America would learn that putting promises into practice is the hardest journey of all. Still, the power of the 14th Amendment could not be buried. From schoolhouses to courthouses, its words whispered hope, that freedom wasn't reserved for a few, that justice could stretch across color lines, state lines, and class lines, that America's greatest strength was in fulfilling its unfinished promises. But change never comes without struggle, and as the ink dried on the 14th Amendment, new battles for equality were just beginning. Stay with me, because the fight to make these words real would test the courage of a nation. History has taught us, writing words on paper is easy, living those words is the true test of a nation's soul. The 14th Amendment promised equality, but promises alone do not silence prejudice. It declared protection, but declarations alone do not dismantle hatred. It spoke of justice, but justice is a road paved with resistance, sacrifice, and unwavering belief. And so, the ink had barely dried on the 14th Amendment. When the battle to make it real began across the South, old systems of oppression simply changed their face. Slavery was gone, but segregation was born. Chains were removed, but invisible barriers replaced them. The promise of equal protection collided head on with deeply rooted racism, fear, and defiance. Jim Crow laws, two words that would haunt America for nearly a century. They divided schools. They separated buses. They kept water fountains labeled for whites only. They whispered a cruel lie that skin color determined worth. And in the shadows of these laws, millions who were told they were equal realized that equality on paper wasn't yet equality in practice. But here's where the human spirit refuses to break, because every barrier invites courage, every injustice awakens the fight for dignity. Ordinary people, mothers, fathers, students, workers began to rise. They challenged unjust laws. They sat in places they weren't allowed. They marched through streets demanding the words of the 14th Amendment be honored, not ignored. The courts became battlefields. Protest became a language of the unheard. From small towns to national headlines, America's unfinished promise was laid bare for all to see. There were victories, hard, won, courageous, incomplete, but undeniable. Cases like Brown v. Board of Education shattered the lie that separate but equal could coexist with justice. The Supreme Court, invoking the very words of the 14th Amendment, declared, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. It was a turning point, but not the finish line. The fight for civil rights intensified. Marches from Selma, voices from Birmingham jail cells, dreams shared on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Each act of courage echoed the spirit of the 14th Amendment. Each demand for justice carried the same heartbeat: equal protection, due process, citizenship with dignity. Yet change was slow. Hatred, deeply rooted, does not surrender overnight, but neither does hope. And neither does the human will to rise. The struggles to make the 14th Amendment real were not just legal battles. They were human stories, stories of defiance, of pain, of victory snatched from despair. And though the journey has stretched across decades, the promise of the 14th Amendment continues to ignite the fight for a better, more equal America. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, we meet the heroes known and unknown who carried this promise on their shoulders. Every great struggle needs its heroes, not just the ones etched into history books, but the quiet, relentless souls who rise when rising is dangerous, when standing up means standing alone. The 14th Amendment, born from war, fueled by hope, would remain mere words. If not for those brave enough to live its promise. This is their story. Some names we know. Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice. But long before he wore the robe, he stood in courtroom after courtroom, carrying the weight of justice on his shoulders. It was Marshall, armed with nothing but his voice and the Constitution, who argued cases that challenged segregation itself, daring to believe that America could live up to its own ideals, his most famous victory. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. In that historic moment, the highest court in the land echoed what brave hearts had been saying for decades. Separate but equal is a lie. Equality cannot be divided. But heroes aren't only found in courtrooms. They walk the streets, they ride the buses, they dare to sit where they're told they don't belong. Rosa Parks, with quiet defiance, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, not out of anger, but out of belief. A belief that dignity should not come with conditions, that the 14th Amendment wasn't just for paper, it was for people like her. Her courage sparked a movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, showing the world that change begins with one small, defiant act. And then there's Martin Luther King Jr., a preacher, a dreamer, a relentless voice for justice. King didn't carry weapons. He carried words, words rooted in faith, justice, and the very promise of the 14th Amendment. His dream, that one day America's children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, his marches, his speeches, his sacrifices, all woven into the fabric of a nation struggling to become better. But beyond the legends, there were countless unsung heroes, the students who faced angry mobs to integrate schools, the mothers who wept but still sent their children to classrooms once barred to them, the ordinary people who believed equality was worth the risk, worth the pain, worth everything. They understood that change is not gifted, it is earned, and the 14th Amendment, though born from law, comes alive through action. It is easy to forget that heroes aren't distant figures. They're us, flawed, afraid, determined. They remind us that the battle for equality is not just history, it's legacy, and that legacy lives on. Every time someone stands for justice, speaks for the silenced, or dares to believe in a more equal world, but the journey wasn't finished. The courts would be tested. The meaning of equality would be stretched, debated, and redefined. Stay with me, because the next chapter brings us to the Supreme Court, where the fate of equality would hang in the balance. The fight for equality didn't end with speeches in the streets. It carried on, in the quiet, imposing halls of justice where words are measured, where history is debated, and where the future is carved. One ruling at a time, the Supreme Court, 9 black, robed figures entrusted with interpreting the Constitution, entrusted with holding America accountable to its promises. And no promise carried more weight or more controversy than the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, due process for all, simple words, but in practice they stirred fierce battles. For every advance in civil rights, for every brave protest, the final word often came from the marble steps of the court. Sometimes those decisions inspired hope. Other times, they exposed how far the nation still had to travel. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1008, 196. A name etched in painful memory. Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, challenged segregation, refusing to sit in a whites-only rail car in Louisiana. His case reached the Supreme Court, demanding the promise of the 14th Amendment be honored, but the court faltered. In a decision that shook the foundation of justice, they upheld segregation, crafting the phrase that would haunt generations: separate but equal, but separate was never equal. It was a mask for discrimination. It was a legal barrier disguised as fairness. For decades, this ruling gave cover to injustice, segregated schools, divided buses, fractured communities. But the story wasn't over. because the same 14th Amendment, the same promise, would one day become the tool for tearing down those walls. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, faced a nation at a crossroads. The question was simple yet profound. Can segregation in public schools ever be equal? The answer: reshaped America. In a unanimous decision, the court declared, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. With those words, the tides of history turned. The 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection wasn't just symbolic. It became enforceable, but change met resistance. Some schools closed rather than integrate. Leaders defied federal orders. The struggle for equality, though backed by law, demanded courage in every corner of society. The Supreme Court became a battlefield for human dignity, from education to voting rights to marriage equality in our modern times. The 14th Amendment, born from the ashes of civil war, became the sword and shield for generations who refused to accept second-class status. It reminded America and the world that justice evolves, but only if people demand it, from Plessy to Brown, from setbacks to triumphs. The words of the 14th Amendment echoed through courtrooms, marches, and hearts. But equality is a journey, not a destination. Stay with me, because the fight for justice isn't confined to history. The 14th Amendment continues to shape America today, in ways more urgent than ever. The 14th Amendment is not a relic of dusty history books. It is not a faded document locked away behind glass. It lives in every courtroom, every protest, every conversation where justice is demanded. Over 150 years since its birth, the 14th Amendment continues to ripple across America, shaping rights, sparking debate, and reminding us that the promise of equality is never truly finished. Think about it. Who gets to be an American? Who is protected by the law? Who decides whose rights matter? The answers are written in the soul of the 14th Amendment, from the fight for civil rights to the struggles for marriage equality. From voting rights to debates over immigration, this amendment remains the backbone of the ongoing quest for fairness. Marriage equality, Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015. The Supreme Court, invoking the 14th Amendment, declared that love knows no boundaries. That two people, regardless of gender, have the right to marry, to build a life, to be seen as equals in the eyes of the law. It was more than a legal victory. It was a reflection of a nation evolving, daring to stretch the meaning of equality to all corners of society. But the 14th Amendment's influence doesn't stop there. It fuels debates on immigration, reminding us that children born on American soil, regardless of their parents' status, are citizens with full rights. It underpins battles for fair policing, pushing back against abuses of power. It drives conversations about gender equality, disability rights, and protections for marginalized communities. Yet with every step forward comes resistance. In modern headlines, the 14th Amendment is at the center of fierce discussions, debates over its meaning, its reach, its promise. Can it guarantee health care? Does it apply to unborn life? Should it define citizenship differently? These questions aren't abstract. They are the heartbeat of democracy, reminders that the Constitution is a living document, meant to grow, to adapt, to reflect the times. But here's the truth. The 14th Amendment is only as powerful as the people who demand its protection. Laws can be written, rights can be declared, but without vigilance, without courage, they risk becoming hollow words. The fight for equality is not confined to history's pages. It lives in classrooms, in voting booths, in quiet acts of defiance, in bold calls for justice. The 14th Amendment is not finished because America's journey toward its highest ideals is not finished. We are the inheritors of its promise, And with that inheritance comes responsibility. Stay with me, because as we close this chapter, we must ask ourselves, where does the journey for equality go from here? And how can each of us play our part in shaping that future? The 14th Amendment began as words, but words become history, history becomes legacy, and legacy becomes the foundation upon which new generations rise. America's story at its core is unfinished. It is the story of struggle, of setback, of bold dreams, and the relentless pursuit of a more perfect union. The 14th Amendment reminds us that equality is not gifted by time. It is fought for, defended, renewed, by those courageous enough to believe change is possible, from the battlefields of the Civil War, to the marches of the Civil Rights Movement, to the modern-day protests for justice, inclusion, and dignity. The spirit of the 14th Amendment beats on, but the journey continues. Equality is not a destination marked by a single victory. It is a daily choice to stand for fairness, to challenge injustice, to see every human being as worthy of respect. The faces of the struggle may change, the laws may evolve, but the core question remains, will we, as a people, honor the promise of equality for all? It begins in classrooms where young minds learn not just dates and facts, but the values that define a nation. It continues in courtrooms where brave advocates demand the Constitution protect the vulnerable, not just the privileged. It echoes in our communities when neighbors, strangers, and leaders choose unity over division. The 14th Amendment lives when a student demands access to the same opportunities as their peers, a family stands up against discrimination, a citizen speaks out for those silenced by fear, and yes, it lives in the quiet moments too, when someone refuses to look away from injustice, when ordinary people remember that history is not written by fate, but by courage. The road ahead is not easy. It never has been, but progress has never been about perfection, it's about persistence. The heroes of the past, Thurgood Marshall, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and countless unnamed champions showed us that change is born from ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You are part of that story now. We all are. The 14th Amendment is not a chapter closed. It is a living, breathing promise that the fight for dignity, justice, and equality belongs to each generation. And the journey continues. So, when you see injustice, speak. When you face division, unite. When you doubt the power of one voice, remember the voices that came before you. Because as long as there are those willing to rise, to fight, to hope, the dream of equality will never fade. The 14th Amendment reminds us, a nation is not defined by its flaws, but by its courage to overcome them, and together, we continue the journey.